The cold steel of the chains bit into Zyara's wrists as she struggled against them, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The metal was laced with suppressive energy, dulling the natural bioluminescence of her skin. Normally, her kind glowed with a shifting spectrum of colors, but now her body was dim, only flickers of blue and green pulsed weakly beneath her skin. She yanked again, twisting her arms, but the bindings held firm. Above her, the sky was a deep void, stars veiled behind thick storm clouds. The only illumination came from the distant cityscape, a pale glow on the horizon. Wind howled through the desolate rail yard, carrying the scent of rust, oil, and impending rain. The train tracks stretched endlessly in both directions, vanishing into darkness. A rhythmic vibration trembled through the rails beneath her, subtle but growing. The train was coming. Fear coiled inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Panic would not save her. She had been betrayed, discarded like refuse by the very people she had trusted. Kiernan's voice still echoed in her ears, smooth and mocking as he secured the last of her restraints. Diplomacy is a game, Zyara. And you were always a losing hand. He had smiled as he left her there, vanishing into the night with the others. The Obsidian Syndicate, fanatics who saw her presence on Earth as an infestation, had chosen a cruelly theatrical execution. No bullets, no blade. Just cold, unfeeling machinery, one that wouldn't hesitate or question its orders. She turned her head, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Hope was a foolish thing, but still she searched. There had to be something, someone. But there was nothing except the sound of the wind and the growing murmur of the approaching train. Then footsteps. They were hesitant at first, the slow crunch of boots against gravel. Zyara tensed. Not Kiernan. Not one of the syndicate. The rhythm was different, the steps less deliberate. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, stopping a few yards away. Human. Male. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face mostly hidden by the hood of his jacket. A work belt was slung around his waist, pouches filled with tools. His stance was cautious, like someone who had seen trouble before and didn't care for more of it. For a long moment he simply looked at her. Zyara saw the shift in his posture. Wariness, calculation. She had been on Earth long enough to recognize the look. He wasn't sure if helping her was worth the risk. Please, she said, her voice hoarse. Help me. He exhaled sharply as if debating with himself. The train's distant hum deepened into a low growl. The man's gaze flickered to the tracks, then back to her. Who did this to you? His voice was rough, edged with suspicion. No time. Zyara rattled the chains. Train's coming. His jaw tightened. Another second passed. Then he moved. He dropped to one knee beside her, fingers tracing the cuffs. They were reinforced, humming faintly with energy. He muttered a curse under his breath and reached for a tool on his belt. The train's horn split the night. Zyara flinched. She could see the light now, a pinprick growing into a blinding glare. It would be on them in less than a minute. Can you cut them? She pressed. I don't know. His hands worked fast, prying at the locking mechanisms. Sparks leaped as he tried to force his way through. The metal didn't budge. The ground rumbled. A flash of desperation clawed through Zyara's mind. She focused what little energy she had left, willing the dampened power within her veins to surge. A flicker of golden light danced along her fingers, but the chains absorbed it hungrily, drinking it down like a parasite. She gasped as the effort drained her further. Damn it, the man growled. He abandoned the tool, scanning the area. His eyes locked onto something, a rusted control box a few feet away. He shot to his feet and sprinted toward it. Zyara twisted to follow his movement. The train was bearing down, metal shrieking against metal. He reached the box, yanked it open, and exposed a mess of tangled wires. Hurry, she cried. His hands flew over the components, making rapid adjustments. There was a loud crack, and suddenly the chains around her wrists and ankles sparked violently. A surge of electricity jolted through her body, making her cry out. Then release. She barely had time to register her freedom before rough hands seized her, yanking her off the tracks just as the train thundered through. They hit the ground hard. The roar of the passing train drowned everything else, wind and dust whipping around them. Zyara clutched at the earth, panting, her body weak and trembling. Took a moment for the world to still. The train was gone, its presence lingering only in the fading echoes. Sayara turned her head. The human was lying beside her, breathing heavily. After a few seconds he pushed himself up onto one elbow and looked at her. "You all right?" He swallowed, nodding. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. Then he exhaled a weary chuckle, shaking his head. "Hell of a way to meet someone." Sayara managed the faintest smile. "Yes." He sat up, wincing. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, but the gravity of her situation was heavier still. She wasn't safe. The syndicate wouldn't stop hunting her. The man must have seen something in her expression because his own turned grim. He pushed himself to his feet and held out a hand. "I don't know what you did to piss off the kind of people who do this," he said, "but I've got a feeling it's not over." Sayara hesitated. He had saved her. He didn't have to do anything more. And yet he was still here. She took his hand. His grip was firm, warm. A tether to something steady in the chaos. "You're right," she said softly. "It's not over." The night pressed heavily around them as Daniel led Sayara through the skeletal remains of an abandoned industrial site. Shadows clung to rusted beams and shattered windows, and the scent of damp concrete and machine oil lingered in the stagnant air. She moved carefully, still drained from her ordeal, but urgency kept her upright. The Obsidian Syndicate would be hunting her by now. She could almost feel their presence creeping through the darkness just beyond sight. Daniel glanced back at her, his brow furrowed. "You sure you're not gonna pass out on me?" "I'll manage," Sayara murmured, though the weight of exhaustion gnawed at her bones. Her bioluminescence, usually a vibrant pulse beneath her skin, remained dim, a sign of just how much energy she had lost. He studied her for a moment before nodding. "We can't stay out in the open. Follow me." He led her through a side entrance, ducking under a collapsed section of roofing. Inside, the space was vast and hollow, filled with rusting machinery and the skeletal remains of long-forgotten workstations. The air was thick with dust. Daniel moved with practiced ease, as though he had navigated places like this before. She followed him deeper, past shattered glass and tangled wires, until they reached a cluster of old crates. He stopped, scanning the space around them. "We should be clear here for a few minutes." Sayara leaned against one of the crates, catching her breath. "They won't stop hunting me." Daniel folded his arms. "Who are they?" "The Obsidian Syndicate," she said, her voice heavy with bitterness. "A human faction that believes my presence, any alien presence, is a threat. They see my people as invaders no matter our intentions." "And your intentions?" "To prevent a war," she said simply. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze. "And they chained you to train tracks to make sure that didn't happen?" She exhaled. "I was betrayed." The word felt hollow, insufficient to convey the depth of what had been taken from her. Kiernan had once been an ally, a bridge between Earth and Velthor. She had trusted him. And in return he had ensured that no alliance would ever form. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I've seen betrayal up close before." His voice had an edge to it, a weight that hinted at things unsaid. But he didn't elaborate. Instead he ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "So what's their next move?" "They'll track me. They won't stop until they're sure I'm dead." He frowned. "Are you carrying a tracker?" Sayara hesitated before reaching up to her neck, pressing her fingers just beneath the skin. A faint pulse of warmth responded. "It's embedded. Deep." Daniel crouched beside her, studying the spot she had indicated. "Can you disable it?" "Not in my condition." "Then I'll do it." He reached into his belt, pulling out a small knife. She tensed. "I'm not going to kill you," he said dryly, then softened. "But if you want to get out of this alive, we have to take the risk." Sayara held his gaze for a long moment before giving a slow nod. He moved quickly, working with steady hands. A sharp sting, then pressure. She clenched her jaw but didn't flinch. After a few moments he extracted a small, silver disc, flickering faintly with alien energy. "Got it." He crushed it under his boot. A tiny burst of static crackled in the air, then faded. Sayara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For a brief moment there was silence. Then from the distance, metallic clicks. The unmistakable sound of drones activating. Daniel tensed. "They're here." Sayara forced herself to stand. "Then we run." They moved quickly, weaving between rusted beams and crumbling structures. The hum of the drones grew louder, their scanning beams slicing through the darkness like searchlights. Sayara could feel the energy waves pulsing around them, probing for heat signatures. Daniel pulled her toward a low alcove, pressing them both against the cold concrete as a drone passed overhead. Its red light scanned the area, pausing briefly before continuing its sweep. "They're scanning for movement," Daniel whispered. Sayara closed her eyes, focusing. She could slow her heart rate, dim her energy signature even further. The drone hesitated. For one agonizing second it hovered. Then it moved on. Daniel exhaled. "Nice trick." Sayara forced a small, tired smile. "Not one I can hold for long." He nodded, already scanning their surroundings. "We need to disable them." His gaze flicked to an old electrical box mounted on the far wall. "I can trigger an EMP short burst, just enough to fry their sensors." Sayara didn't hesitate. "Do it." Daniel moved fast, pulling wires, crossing connections. A sudden spark, then. The drones shuddered midair. Their red lights flickered once, then died. They dropped to the ground in unison, motionless. The silence that followed was unnerving. Sayara turned to Daniel. "They'll send more." "Yeah," he said, standing. "Which means we need to leave. Now." They made it to the far exit before the first shot rang out. A bolt of energy seared past them, striking the metal beam beside Daniel's head. He swore, grabbing Sayara's arm and pulling her behind cover. A voice echoed through the space. Smooth. Confident. "You didn't think I'd let you slip away that easily, did you?" "Kiernan." Sayara's pulse pounded. She peered around the edge of their cover, spotting him across the room. He stood flanked by syndicate operatives, their weapons glowing in the dim light. "Your mission was over the moment you stepped onto this planet," Kiernan continued. "You should have stayed in your place, Sayara." Anger burned through her exhaustion. She stepped forward before Daniel could stop her. "I believed in peace," she said coldly. "You turned it into war." Kiernan smirked. "War was always coming. I just made sure you weren't in the way." He nodded to his men. "Kill them." Sayara moved before they could fire. She called on the last of her energy reserves, forcing a surge of power through her body. Golden light erupted from her hands, slamming into the nearest soldier and sending him flying. Daniel took the opening, grabbing a discarded rifle and firing a shot that struck another assailant square in the chest. Kiernan's smirk faltered. Daniel turned to Sayara. "We need to go. Now." She hesitated, her gaze locking onto Kiernan. A part of her wanted to finish this. To make sure he never did this to anyone else. But the battle was already lost. More of them would come. She turned and ran, following Daniel into the night. Behind them, Kiernan's voice rang out, laced with fury. "You can't run forever." But Sayara had no intention of running forever. She would survive. She would fight. And she would win. The city stretched before them in a maze of steel and neon, its towering structures casting jagged shadows beneath the flickering streetlights. The air was thick with the scent of rain and exhaust, the night alive with distant sirens and murmured conversations from unseen figures. Sayara and Daniel moved swiftly through the back alleys, their steps muffled against the damp pavement. Neither spoke, their silence bound by urgency. Kiernan wouldn't let this go. The syndicate would be regrouping, recalculating, and sending more than drones next time. Sayara's body ached with exhaustion, but adrenaline kept her upright. She had burned through what little energy reserves she had left back at the industrial site. Now her bioluminescence was barely a faint shimmer beneath her skin, flickering weakly like a dying ember. She had never felt this drained before, this close to collapse. But she couldn't stop. Daniel pulled her into the shadows of an abandoned loading dock, pressing his back against the wall as he scanned the area. His breathing was steady, but tension lined his face. "We need a plan," he said finally, his voice low. Sayara swallowed hard. "There's only one way this ends." His gaze flicked to her, unreadable. "And that is, I have to stop Kiernan." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "You mean kill him?" She hesitated, the weight of the words settling in her chest. "If I don't, he'll keep coming. He'll make sure no other Valkyrie set foot on this planet. The Syndicate will use my execution as a warning." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "And how exactly do you plan on getting to him? We barely made it out last time." "I know how he thinks," Sayara said. "He'll want to make a public statement out of this." He'll want the world to see my failure. She straightened, a cold certainty solidifying within her. Which means he won't hide. He'll be at Syndicate headquarters waiting for me to run right into his trap. Daniel shook his head. You want to walk into his trap? I want to end this, she said firmly. And I won't be alone. Daniel studied her, his jaw tightening. Then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You're insane. Does that mean you're in? A dry chuckle escaped him. Guess I don't have anything better to do tonight. They made their way toward the city's core, navigating through side streets and abandoned service tunnels until they reached the edge of the Syndicate's territory. The headquarters loomed ahead, a sleek glass fortress rising above the cityscape, its reflective surface gleaming under the artificial glow of the skyline. Security drones hovered in coordinated patterns, their crimson optics sweeping the perimeter. Armed guards flanked the main entrance, their expressions unreadable beneath their tactical visors. Sayara felt Daniel tense beside her. Getting in won't be easy. I never expected it to be. She reached into the folds of her jacket, producing a small metallic device no larger than her palm. It pulsed with faint, shifting energy. Daniel raised a brow. And what's that? A failsafe. Sayara pressed it against her wrist. A warm hum resonated through her skin, and a sudden surge of energy flooded her body, momentarily pushing back the crushing exhaustion. Her bioluminescence flared to life again, gold and violet ribbons of light dancing beneath her skin. Daniel took a step back. What exactly did you just do? I tapped into a last reserve. Her voice was steady, but the truth settled heavily in her chest. This kind of energy boost wouldn't last. It was borrowed time, and when it ran out, the crash would be worse than anything she had ever experienced. But she wouldn't need long. Daniel exhaled sharply. All right. What's the plan? Sayara turned her gaze toward the entrance. We go loud. The first explosion rocked the compound seconds later. Smoke billowed upward as the shockwave sent the security drones spiraling out of formation. Alarms blared, and the guards scrambled to respond, their weapons raised as they searched for the threat. Sayara and Daniel moved fast. He fired the first shot, dropping one of the guards with precise accuracy. She followed, channeling raw energy into her palms and sending a concussive blast into the remaining sentries, knocking them off their feet. They didn't stop to fight, there was no time. They sprinted through the chaos, slipping past the initial wave of responders and into the building's lower levels. The corridors were sleek and sterile, lined with reinforced doors and biometric scanners. Sayara pressed forward, every fiber of her being focused on the one goal that had carried her this far. Kiernan was waiting. He could feel it. They reached the central chamber, a vast open space lined with holographic displays and surveillance feeds flickering in the dim light. And there, standing at the far end, was Kiernan. He was alone, hands clasped behind his back, watching them with the same infuriating smirk he always wore. I was wondering when you'd come to your senses. Sayara stepped forward, her voice cold. It ends tonight. Kiernan chuckled. Oh, Sayara. It ended the moment you set foot on this planet. With a flick of his wrist, the walls around them shifted. Automated turrets descended from the ceiling, their barrels humming with lethal energy. Sayara's muscles coiled, but before she could react, Daniel moved. He threw something, a pulse grenade, compact and deadly. It detonated in a burst of static, sending a ripple of electromagnetic interference through the room. The turrets sparked and died. Kiernan's smirk faltered. Sayara didn't hesitate. She lunged, summoning every ounce of strength left in her body. Kiernan barely had time to react before she struck, a concentrated blast of golden energy colliding with his chest. He staggered back, eyes wide with shock. For the first time he looked afraid. Sayara advanced, her hands trembling from the effort. You played your game well, Kiernan. But you underestimated me. He coughed, blood speckling his lips. You think killing me will change anything? He laughed, weak but defiant. The Syndicate is bigger than me. You can't stop what's coming. Sayara's gaze didn't waver. We'll see. She raised her hand. Another surge of energy crackled to life, ready to end this once and for all. Then Daniel's voice cut through the silence. Sayara. She hesitated. Daniel stepped forward. If you do this, you're proving him right. His voice was calm but firm. He wants you to be the threat. He needs you to be the monster. Sayara's breath caught in her throat. Kiernan watched her, his smirk returning despite the pain. He was waiting for her to make the choice. Her fingers curled into a fist, the energy fading from her palm. "I won't be what you want me to be," she said quietly. Then she turned and walked away. Daniel followed without a word. Behind them, Kiernan slumped to the ground, defeated but alive. As they stepped out into the night, Sayara felt the weight of everything settle onto her shoulders. The war wasn't over. The syndicate wouldn't stop. But she had made her choice. And for now that was enough. The night air was heavy with the scent of ozone and smoke as Sayara and Daniel slipped into the labyrinthine alleys beyond the syndicate's headquarters. Their escape had been clean, but the weight of what had transpired clung to them unspoken. The city pulsed around them, oblivious to the battle that had just shaken its core. Neon lights flickered in rhythmic patterns, and the hum of distant hovercrafts blended with the low murmur of nightlife. The world moved on uncaring. Sayara's steps faltered. The artificial energy she had tapped into earlier was fading fast, leaving her hollow, each movement a struggle. The edges of her vision blurred. She felt Daniel's hand steady her arm, firm but not forceful. "You're about to drop," he murmured. She wanted to protest, but her body betrayed her. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and before she could stop it, her knees buckled. Daniel caught her, guiding her against the rough surface of a brick wall. "Breathe," he instructed, crouching beside her. She closed her eyes, forcing slow, measured breaths. Even still, the world swayed. "I'll be fine." Daniel didn't look convinced. "You just burned through every last ounce of strength. We need to find you a place to rest." "There's no time," she rasped. "Kiernan will regroup. The syndicate won't come charging after us in broad daylight," Daniel finished. "They'll lay low, reassess. You need to do the same." He hated that he was right. Every instinct screamed at her to keep moving, to strike before they could strike back. But her body was past its limit. The energy reserves of her species weren't limitless, and she had pushed herself to the brink. Daniel scanned the surrounding area before nodding toward a dimly lit side street. "I know a place. Come on." She let him help her to her feet, her movements sluggish, every step an effort. They wove through the city's underbelly, slipping past crowds and under flickering street lamps until they reached a nondescript building tucked between two towering complexes. The entrance was a simple steel door with no markings, no signs. Daniel rapped a coded knock against the metal, and after a moment it creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning them both before settling on Daniel with wary familiarity. "You're late." Daniel smirked. "Didn't know I was expected, Val." Val crossed her arms. "You don't show up unless trouble's following you." Her gaze flickered to Sayara, assessing. "And from the looks of her, I'd say you're in deep." Sayara tried to steady herself, but even standing was becoming difficult. Val sighed, stepping aside. "Get in before someone sees you." The interior was a stark contrast to the cold steel of the syndicate's fortress. Warm, cluttered, filled with the scent of burning incense and old books. A workspace lined one wall, scattered with mechanical parts and outdated tech. A cot sat in the far corner, and Daniel wasted no time guiding Sayara toward it. Val leaned against the workbench, arms still crossed. "You gonna tell me why you're dragging an alien fugitive into my place?" Daniel pulled a chair around and sat, exhaling. "Short version? The syndicate wants her dead, and I'm not a fan of their methods." Val raised an eyebrow. "And the long version?" Sayara, still catching her breath, answered instead. "I came here to negotiate peace between our species. I was betrayed." Val studied her, something unreadable in her expression. "Betrayed, huh? You mean by Kiernan?" Sayara's fingers curled into the thin blanket draped over her. "You know him." "I know of him." Val's jaw tightened. "I deal in information. And the syndicate's been making a lot of noise lately. A few months back, rumors started circulating about a planned execution. Someone they wanted to make an example of." Her gaze darkened. "I'm guessing that was you." Sayara nodded. "And it won't stop with me. They want every Velthari gone." Val let out a slow breath, rubbing her temple. "You really know how to pick your fights, Daniel." He gave a lopsided grin. "Wouldn't be the first time, Val." She muttered something under her breath before pushing off the workbench. "I've got a few contacts who don't exactly love the syndicate. If you're planning to fight back, I can make some calls." Sayara forced herself to sit upright, ignoring the way her vision swam. I don't want a war. Val gave her a knowing look. War's already here, sweetheart. Question is, are you gonna survive it? Sayara swallowed hard. She had spent her entire life working toward peace, believing that words could bridge the gap between species. But words had failed. And now she was left with only one certainty. She couldn't run forever. Daniel leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. If we're doing this, we do it smart. No suicide missions, no reckless charges. We take Kiernan down, expose the syndicate for what they really are. If the world sees them for the extremists they are, they lose power. Sayara looked at him, surprised by the steel in his voice. She had expected resistance, hesitation. But not this. Not commitment. Val tilted her head. And after that? Sayara hesitated. After that, we see if peace is still possible. Val let out a short laugh. You're an optimist. I'll give you that. Sayara wasn't sure if it was optimism or desperation. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she wasn't alone in this fight. And for the first time in a long while she believed they had a chance. The dim light of the underground hideout flickered as Sayara sat upright on the cot, forcing herself to ignore the dull ache thrumming beneath her skin. Every cell in her body craved rest, but she wouldn't allow it. Not yet. Across the room, Daniel and Val spoke in low voices, their words sharp and urgent. Val was skeptical and Sayara couldn't blame her. Trust was a luxury in a city where alliances shifted like sand in a storm. Even if we expose Kiernan, the syndicate won't just collapse, Val said, arms crossed. They've embedded themselves into the system. Politicians, corporations, law enforcement. Hell, half the city works for them without even realizing it. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Then we cut out the head. Kiernan is the public face. If we can take him down publicly in a way that forces the syndicate's hidden allies to distance themselves, we have a shot. Sayara pushed herself to stand, her legs steadier than before. He's careful. He won't expose himself unless he's certain he has the upper hand. Val smirked. Then we make him think he does. Silence stretched between them. Sayara studied Val, reading the sharp intelligence in her gaze. You have a plan. Val tilted her head. I have an opportunity. There's a high-level syndicate gathering tomorrow night. Kiernan will be there, surrounded by the worst people this city has to offer. It's a show of strength. New weapons, new alliances. They want to remind everyone who's in charge. Daniel's brow furrowed. And you can get us in? Val shrugged. Not directly. But I can get you close enough to crash the party. Sayara inhaled slowly. If we do this, it has to be more than just an attack. We need evidence, something undeniable. If we can broadcast proof of what the syndicate is planning, of their crimes, the right people will have no choice but to turn against them. Val nodded, considering. There's always a digital trail. And the syndicate's arrogance makes them sloppy. I know someone who can get us inside their encrypted files, but we'll need access to a terminal at the gathering. Sayara and Daniel exchanged glances. The risks were obvious. Walking into a syndicate stronghold was suicide. But the alternative was worse. Daniel sighed. Then I guess we're going to a party. The following night, the city's skyline was alive with artificial brilliance, a sharp contrast to the darkness that lurked beneath its polished surface. The syndicate's gathering was held in a towering glass structure that loomed over the surrounding streets, its entrance guarded by sleek security drones and heavily armed enforcers. Wealth draped itself over the attendees like a second skin, sharp suits, flowing gowns, and eyes that gleamed with calculated hunger. Sayara and Daniel moved through the outer perimeter, dressed to blend in. Val had secured them access through a secondary entrance, a favor from one of her less scrupulous contacts. Inside, the air buzzed with hushed conversations and the clinking of expensive glassware. Sayara felt the weight of hidden gazes. Even in disguise, she stood out. The shimmering bioluminescence that ran beneath her skin was faint but undeniable, a subtle glow that marked her as other. She ignored the prickle of unease and focused. They had a single chance to pull this off. Daniel tapped his earpiece. Val, we're in. Her voice crackled softly in response. Good. Your target's in the main hall. Kiernan is making a speech in 15 minutes. That's your window. Sayara's pulse quickened. If they could access a terminal before then, They could transmit evidence of the syndicate's dealings in real time. It wouldn't just be an accusation, it would be undeniable proof. They weaved through the opulent space, past figures draped in silk and shadows. Sayara caught glimpses of military officials, corporate executives, and underworld leaders, pillars of power that upheld the syndicate's reach. Then she saw him. Kiernan stood at the head of the room, poised and composed, the embodiment of control. His presence commanded attention without effort. He was speaking to a small cluster of individuals, his expression relaxed, confident. He had no idea they were here. Daniel nudged her. Terminals in the east corridor. They slipped away, moving with deliberate ease. The corridor was quieter, lined with private rooms and security stations. A lone guard stood near the terminal access point. Daniel didn't hesitate. He approached the man casually, then in a blur of motion struck. The guard crumpled soundlessly and Daniel caught him, dragging him into a side alcove before he could be seen. Sayara worked fast. The interface recognized her presence immediately, scanning the faint Velthary energy signature that still lingered in her cells. The syndicate had built its security systems with her species in mind, never anticipating that one of them would use it against them. The screen flickered, lines of data scrolling rapidly. Sayara inserted the decryption module Val had given her, and the files began transferring. Then the alarm blared. Daniel swore. They know. Sayara's fingers flew over the controls. Almost there. A voice cut through the chaos, cold and amused. I was hoping you'd come. Kiernan. He stood at the corridor's entrance, flanked by enforcers, his expression unreadable. His eyes locked onto Sayara's and for a split second something flickered there, not anger. Not fear. Amusement. Sayara's breath caught. He had expected this. Daniel reached for his weapon but Kiernan raised a hand. Don't. If you fire that, you'll be dead before you hit the ground. Sayara straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze without flinching. You're done, Kiernan. Everything you've built, it's crumbling. He smirked. Is it? The screen behind her blinked. Transfer complete. The files had been sent. Kiernan's smirk faltered. Sayara took a step forward, her voice steady. You feel that? That's the weight of the truth crashing down on you. A flicker of something, realization, calculation, crossed his face. He was already considering his next move, searching for a way to control the fallout. Sayara didn't give him the chance. She surged forward, channeling the last of her strength into a concussive blast that sent him reeling. Daniel moved in tandem, taking down the nearest enforcer. The corridor exploded into chaos. Sayara grabbed Daniel's wrist. Time to go. They ran. The building shook with the force of panicked movement, guests and security scattering in every direction. Sirens wailed, but above it all, the sound of distant transmissions filled the air. News outlets, emergency broadcasts, the spreading wildfire of information that couldn't be contained. They had done it. As they disappeared into the city's maze once more, Sayara allowed herself a single breath of triumph. For the first time the syndicate was exposed. And the fight was just beginning. The city roared with unrest. Overnight, the balance of power had shifted and the syndicate's grip was loosening. The broadcast of their crimes had spread like wildfire, igniting protests and forcing once loyal allies to reconsider their allegiances. The streets pulsed with an energy Sayara had never felt before, a volatile mix of fear and rebellion. Yet even as the foundations of their enemy crumbled, she knew the fight wasn't over. She and Daniel had barely made it out of the syndicate's stronghold. They had spent the night moving between safe houses, always one step ahead of the enforcers scouring the city for them. Val had gone silent, working from the shadows to gather what little support remained outside the syndicate's reach. But none of them could ignore the truth. Kiernan was still out there and as long as he lived the syndicate would find a way to survive. Daniel checked the stolen comm device again, his jaw tightening. Still nothing. Sayara leaned against the cracked concrete wall of their temporary hideout, exhaustion threatening to drag her under. They're regrouping. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Yeah. And we're running out of places to hide. A sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Daniel's gun was in his hand instantly, his body tensed for a fight. Sayara remained still, listening. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 more. The signal. Daniel moved cautiously, unlocking the reinforced door just enough to glimpse their visitor. Then he exhaled and pulled it open. Val slipped inside, her face grim. She had ditched her usual confident smirk, her shoulders tight with tension. "We've got a problem." Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Just one." She ignored him, locking the door behind her before turning to Zyara. "Kiernan's making his move. He's going to try and shift the narrative. He's already putting out misinformation, saying the files were doctored, that this is some off-world conspiracy to destabilize the city. And people are listening." Zyara's stomach twisted. "Even after everything they've seen?" Val shrugged, bitterness in her expression. "Fear makes people cling to the familiar. And the Syndicate? They are the familiar." Daniel shook his head. "So what? We just let them take back control?" Val's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not necessarily. Kiernan's not hiding anymore. He's calling for a public address tonight. He wants to assure the city that everything's fine, that the Syndicate is still in charge. He's going to use this as a chance to reassert his power." Zyara frowned. "Unless we stop him." Val nodded. "Exactly." Silence settled between them as the weight of what needed to be done pressed down. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was the final move. If they let Kiernan retake control, all their efforts would be undone. The city would fall back under his rule, and Zyara's people, every Velthari who still believed in peace, would be hunted down until none remained. Daniel met Zyara's gaze, his expression unwavering. "We end this tonight." The broadcast square was already swarming with enforcers when they arrived. Towering screens lined the plaza, their cold glow illuminating the crowd that had gathered. Citizens stood in uneasy silence, waiting for Kiernan's address. Some were wary, others hopeful. A few clutched makeshift signs demanding answers. Zyara's breath was steady, but her hands curled into fists at her sides. She and Daniel moved carefully through the shifting mass of people, keeping to the shadows as they neared the stage. Kiernan stood at the center, his posture relaxed, exuding confidence. He was good at this, controlling the narrative, bending perception to his will. "Not tonight." Val's voice crackled through their earpieces. "I've got access to the main feed. The second Kiernan starts talking, I'm overriding the system. Everyone's going to see what he really is." Zyara exhaled, nodding to herself. "Good. Be ready." Kiernan stepped forward, and the murmurs of the crowd faded. He spread his arms in a gesture of reassurance. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. "You have been lied to." Zyara's pulse spiked. "They want you to believe we are the enemy," Kiernan continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "That we are corrupt, dangerous, that we seek to harm this city rather than protect it." He shook his head, sighing. "But the truth is, we have always been the ones standing between order and chaos." Val's voice cut through their calms. "Almost there." Kiernan continued, his tone shifting, growing sharper. "These attacks, these lies, they come from outsiders. From those who do not understand our way of life. Who seek to divide us." Zyara's hands clenched. She had heard these words before, from warlords who had justified slaughter with the illusion of protection. Then the screens flickered. For a split second, Kiernan's confident mask faltered. He turned, confused, as the images behind him changed. The crowd gasped. The screens displayed everything. Classified Syndicate documents, transaction records, intercepted communications detailing assassinations, betrayals, and the systematic oppression of anyone who dared oppose them. And then the final blow, footage from the night Zyara had been captured. The truth, raw and undeniable. A hush fell over the plaza. Then a murmur. Then a wave of voices rising into something more. Bigger. Recognition. A breaking of the illusion Kiernan had so carefully crafted. Daniel moved before Kiernan could react, surging onto the stage. The enforcers hesitated, uncertain. The crowd was no longer with them. Kiernan turned, fury twisting his features. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think they'll fight for you?" Zyara stepped onto the stage beside Daniel, meeting Kiernan's gaze with unwavering certainty. "They don't have to fight for me," she said, voice carrying through the silent square. "They only have to stop fighting for you." Kiernan lunged. Daniel intercepted him, their struggle fierce and desperate. But Kiernan was fighting against more than just them now. The crowd had turned. Enforcers hesitated. Some lowered their weapons. Others fled. And then a single shot rang out. Kiernan staggered, his expression stunned. He looked down at the wound blooming in his chest, then at the crowd. A woman stood at the front, her hands shaking, a discarded weapon at her feet. She had been one of them. One of his enforcers. And she had made her choice. Kiernan collapsed. The silence that followed was heavy. Then a shift. The people began moving, stepping onto the stage, claiming the space that had been used to control them. The syndicate's power wasn't just broken. It was gone. Sayara inhaled, closing her eyes. It was over. She felt Daniel's hand on her shoulder, grounding her. We did it. She exhaled. Not just us. The city was awake now. And for the first time it was free. The air smelled of ozone and smoke, the remnants of a battle not fought with weapons but with truth. The city had not erupted into chaos as Kiernan had promised. Instead it had stirred, awakening from a long sleep, uncertain but alive. The broadcast square, once a place of intimidation, was now a gathering ground for those who had spent years swallowing their anger. Sayara stood at the edge of the platform looking out over the shifting crowd. Their faces were a mixture of relief and uncertainty, as though they couldn't yet trust that the tide had truly turned. She understood that feeling too well. Victory was a fragile thing. Daniel stood beside her, his stance relaxed but his fingers twitching near the hilt of his concealed blade. He wasn't letting his guard down, not yet. They're waiting for something, he murmured. She nodded. For someone to tell them what happens next. Val approached, dusting herself off from the chaos of the past hour. She had fought her way through the confusion, making sure their plan hadn't been undone by a last-minute betrayal. Kiernan's people are scattering. Some have already made a run for it. Others. She glanced toward the fallen leader's body, slumped and still. They don't know what to do without their puppet master. Sayara exhaled. It was a dangerous moment. Power never vanished, it only changed hands. And without careful guidance, the vacuum left behind by the syndicate would be filled by something just as corrupt, just as ruthless. We can't let the wrong people take control, Daniel said, echoing her thoughts. Val smirked. Then you'd better figure out what the right people look like. Sayara turned back to the crowd. Some faces were familiar. Activists who had fought against the syndicate in secret, workers who had lost everything, families who had been too afraid to fight back until now. They weren't soldiers. They weren't politicians. But they were people. People who had seen the truth and could no longer ignore it. She stepped forward. The murmur of voices quieted as she raised her hand. She had never wanted to be a leader. She had spent years just trying to survive, hoping that someone else would rise up and take on this fight. But now, in this moment, she knew no one was coming. It had to be them. We have a choice, she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pressing against her ribs. For years, the syndicate controlled this city because we let them. We let them lie to us, let them make us believe we were powerless. She paused, letting her words settle. But we are not powerless. And we will not trade one tyrant for another. A ripple moved through the crowd, uncertain but hopeful. She continued. This city belongs to all of us. And we decide what happens next. Silence stretched between them all, heavy and expectant. Then one voice rose, a woman in the front, fists clenched at her sides. Then tell us how. Sayara hesitated. The truth was she didn't know. She had spent so long fighting against oppression that she had never considered what came after. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. We start by making sure the right people don't take what we've fought for. Val nodded. There are still syndicate loyalists out there, people who will try to regroup and rebuild. We need to make sure they don't. The woman in the front, the one who had fired the shot that ended Kiernan, stepped forward. Her face was lined with the weight of choices she had never expected to make. I used to follow orders, she said. I told myself I didn't have a choice. That's a lie I don't want to live with anymore. She lifted her chin. If you're building something better, I want in. That was all it took. One voice, then another. A man who had lost his family to the syndicate. A mechanic who had been forced to work under them or starve. A group of workers who had watched their friends disappear over the years. Sayara saw it happening, the first spark of something real. She turned back to Daniel and Val. This won't be easy. Daniel smirked. Nothing worth doing ever is. Val sighed dramatically. Guess I'm stuck with you too then. Sayara allowed herself the smallest smile. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. But for the first time they weren't alone. And for the first time the city belonged to its people again. The wind carried the scent of rain as Zyara stood atop the crumbling rooftop, looking down at the city below. The streets, once swallowed by the syndicate's control, pulsed with a restless energy. People no longer cowered in the shadows. They moved with purpose, reclaiming spaces that had once belonged to their oppressors. But the embers of revolution burned precariously. A single misstep could see everything they had fought for collapse into chaos. Daniel approached, his boots crunching against the gravel-strewn rooftop. He handed her a metal flask without a word. She accepted it, taking a sip of something strong and bitter. It burned on the way down, grounding her in the moment. Val says there are pockets of resistance still holding out, he said. Some of Kiernan's lieutenants are trying to regroup, hoping to carve out their own little empires. Zyara exhaled sharply. That was always the risk. Cut off the head and the body doesn't always die. It just thrashes. Daniel nodded. But the people are watching now. They aren't so easy to fool anymore. That, at least, was true. The syndicate had relied on secrecy and fear. Now, with their crimes laid bare, trust had shattered. Those who had once ruled from the shadows now found themselves exposed. Some had fled. Others had gone underground, waiting for an opportunity to seize control again. But Zyara wouldn't let that happen. A door creaked open behind them and Val emerged, shaking rain from her coat. "All right," she said, wiping water from her brow. "I've got good news and bad news." Daniel arched a brow. "Start with the good news." Val smirked. "Most of Kiernan's strongholds have been taken over. His resources are drying up, and the people are turning against anyone who tries to claim his throne." Zyara nodded. "And the bad news?" Val's smirk faded. "Someone's trying to get off-world. A high-ranking syndicate officer. If they make it out, they could rebuild elsewhere. Or worse, call for reinforcements." Silence stretched between them. The syndicate wasn't just a local menace. It had tendrils reaching far beyond this city, beyond this planet. If someone escaped with knowledge of what had happened here, they could return with an army. Zyara met Daniel's gaze. He was already thinking the same thing. "Where?" he asked. Val pulled a small device from her pocket, projecting a flickering map into the air. "South Quadrant. A private airfield, heavily guarded. They're scheduled to lift off in 2 hours." Zyara straightened. "Then we don't have much time." The rain had started falling in earnest by the time they reached the outskirts of the airfield. The storm masked their approach, but it also made visibility difficult. They crouched in the tall grass, watching the guards pace along the perimeter. The transport ship loomed ahead, sleek and unmarked, waiting for its passenger. Val tapped her earpiece. "I can disable their communications, buy us a few extra minutes before they call for backup." Daniel checked his weapon. "Make it count." Zyara studied the guards. They weren't syndicate foot soldiers. They were professionals, mercenaries hired to ensure that whoever was on that ship made it off the planet. That meant their target wasn't just some desperate syndicate officer trying to escape. It was someone valuable. They moved swiftly. Val's interference took out the airfield's security grid, and in the confusion, Zyara and Daniel slipped through the defenses like shadows. They dispatched the first set of guards without a sound, taking advantage of the storm's cover. But as they neared the ship, an alarm blared. The mercenaries weren't amateurs. They had contingencies. Gunfire erupted through the night. Zyara pressed herself against a cargo crate, heart hammering. Daniel ducked beside her, his knife slick with rain and blood. "We need to move fast," he said. She nodded, slipping out of cover and moving toward the ship. A guard spotted her and raised his weapon, but she was faster. A sharp twist, a well-placed strike, and he crumpled to the ground. Val's voice crackled through the comms. "They're trying to override my lockout. You need to get on that ship now." Zyara didn't hesitate. She sprinted up the loading ramp, Daniel right behind her. Inside, the ship was eerily quiet, the hum of its engines the only sound. Then a voice cut through the silence. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Zyara turned, her breath catching. At the center of the cargo hold stood a woman draped in dark, tailored clothing. Her presence was unnervingly composed, even as chaos erupted outside. She smiled, tilting her head. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Zyara tightened her grip on her weapon. "Who are you?" The woman stepped forward, unbothered by the tension in the air. "Someone who sees the bigger picture." She gestured around them. Did you really think toppling one man would end this? Kiernan was just a symptom. The real power doesn't die so easily. Daniel moved closer, ready to strike, but the woman lifted a small device between two fingers. A trigger. I wouldn't, she said smoothly. This ship is rigged to explode. Kill me and you die with it. Sayara's pulse pounded. What do you want? The woman's smile widened. To leave. And to remind you that this is far from over. Val's voice came through the earpiece, urgent. Sayara, whatever you're doing, do it fast. I can't hold their systems much longer. Sayara's mind raced. The woman in front of her wasn't just another syndicate officer. She was something more, something worse. A strategist. A survivor. And if she escaped, she would return stronger. Sayara took a slow breath. Then she holstered her weapon. The woman's brow lifted in amusement. Smart choice. Sayara moved as if to step aside, but at the last second she struck. Her fingers found the woman's wrist, twisting hard. The device slipped from her grasp. Before she could react, Daniel was there, his blade pressing against her throat. The woman exhaled, annoyed but not panicked. Impressive. Sayara retrieved the detonator. You're not going anywhere. The woman only smiled. We'll see about that. Val's voice came through again. Security reinforcements are on the way. You need to move. Sayara met Daniel's eyes. They had a choice. Take the woman with them and risk her escaping later, or end this now. The engines whined as the ship prepared for takeoff. Sayara clenched her jaw. They didn't have time. She hit the override on the detonator and alarms blared. The woman's smile finally faltered. Time's up, Sayara said. She and Daniel ran, leaving the woman shouting behind them. They barely made it off the ship before the explosion lit up the night, fire consuming everything. They didn't stop running until they were clear of the wreckage, the storm swallowing the flames. Sayara turned back, chest heaving. The woman was gone. Maybe dead. Maybe not. Daniel wiped rain from his face. That felt too easy. Sayara nodded. Because it was. The syndicate's remnants wouldn't go down quietly. And this woman, whoever she was proof of that. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. The city was still smoldering from the night before. The explosion at the airfield had sent shockwaves through the remaining pockets of syndicate loyalists, forcing them further into hiding. But Sayara knew better than to assume they had won. This was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. She stood at the edge of the main square, where people had begun gathering again, murmuring about what came next. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened with water, reflecting the dim glow of flickering streetlights. The air was thick with the scent of burned metal and unsettled dust. Daniel approached from behind, his presence as steady as ever. Word is spreading, he said. They know the syndicate's power is broken, but they also know someone will try to take their place. Sayara crossed her arms. Then we don't give them the chance. Val joined them, her expression unreadable as she handed Sayara a small data pad. You should see this. Sayara took it, scanning the contents. It was a list of names. Individuals who had slipped through the cracks when the syndicate fell. Some had gone underground, waiting for their moment. Others had simply vanished. And then there was the name at the bottom. Seraphine Voss. Sayara's fingers tightened around the datapad. She hadn't known the woman's name before, but now it was seared into her mind. The strategist who had nearly escaped. The one who had looked at them with amusement as if this was just a temporary setback. She's still alive, Val said. And she won't stay in the shadows for long. Daniel exhaled sharply. Then we find her first. Sayara nodded. The remnants of the syndicate were fractured, disorganized, but Seraphine was dangerous. She wasn't just another lieutenant clawing for scraps. She had a plan. Val glanced toward the crowd forming in the square. We have people willing to fight, she said. But they're not soldiers. And they're tired. They thought winning meant the battle was over. Sayara understood that. The people had fought to tear down their oppressors, but they weren't prepared for the long war ahead. And this would be a war whether they wanted it or not. A voice cut through the murmuring crowd. A man, one of the former factory workers who had been among the first to resist the syndicate, stood on a makeshift platform. His voice trembled with urgency. They say we're free now, he called out. That we took back our city. But what happens next? Who leads us? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. They weren't just worried about lingering syndicate threats. They were worried about the vacuum left behind. Power never stayed unclaimed for long. Sayara stepped forward before hesitation could root her in place. She hadn't asked to be a leader, but the moment demanded it. "We lead ourselves," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "The syndicate ruled because we let them. We let them make decisions for us, tell us what was best while they took everything from us. That ends now." Silence followed, thick with uncertainty. A woman near the front crossed her arms. "And what happens when someone else tries to take control?" Sayara met her gaze. "Then we fight back. But this time we fight for something real." A long pause. Then slowly nods of agreement. They weren't ready to believe just yet, but they were listening. Daniel leaned in slightly. "You sound like a leader." She let out a quiet breath. "I sound like someone who's out of options." Val smirked. "Same thing. The people had hope now, but hope wasn't enough. They needed a plan. And they needed to find Seraphine before she had the chance to strike. Because Sayara knew one thing for certain. Seraphine hadn't run to escape. She had run to rebuild. And when she returned, she wouldn't be alone. The underground safe house smelled of damp metal and old circuitry, a relic from a time before the Syndicate's rule. Now it was one of the few places in the city where plans could be made without prying eyes. Sayara leaned over the holographic display flickering in the center of the room, watching as Val's fingers danced across the console, pulling up layers of encrypted data. "This isn't just a retreat," Val murmured, narrowing her eyes at the screen. "Seraphine's moving resources. Fast." Daniel, arms crossed, studied the glowing map. "Then she's not just trying to disappear. She's rebuilding." Sayara exhaled, her pulse steady but heavy with the weight of the truth. She was never running. She was consolidating. The realization settled over them like a cold mist. The Syndicate had fallen, but Seraphine wasn't interested in picking up its shattered pieces. She was reshaping something new, something more precise. More dangerous. Val tapped a section of the map, magnifying it. "She's been shifting assets to a facility in the outer district. Used to be a black market weapons plant before the Syndicate seized it. Now it looks like she's reclaiming it." Daniel let out a slow breath. "She's not just rebuilding an empire. She's preparing for war." Silence thickened between them. They had spent so long fighting to bring down the Syndicate that they hadn't considered what would happen when someone even more calculated stepped in to replace it. Seraphine wasn't a brute like Kiernan. She didn't rule with raw fear. She was a strategist. She would take what was left and refine it, turning it into something even deadlier. Sayara straightened. "We have to stop her before she gets the chance." Val hesitated. "You're talking about going in now." "With what?" She gestured around them. "We have barely enough firepower to hold the city, let alone take on someone like her." "We don't need to fight a battle," Sayara said. "We need to cut her off before she's ready. She's still moving pieces into place. If we act fast, we can pull the ground out from under her." Daniel gave a small nod. "Sabotage." Sayara met his gaze. "We hit her supply lines. Destroy the weapons before she can use them. Make sure she has nothing to build with." Val exhaled, considering. "All right. But we'll only get one shot at this. If she catches wind of what we're doing, she'll disappear again." Daniel stepped away from the map, grabbing his gear. "Then we make sure she doesn't see us coming." The wind howled as they moved through the outskirts of the city, staying low to avoid detection. The industrial district loomed ahead, its skeletal remains standing against the dim glow of emergency lights. Power hadn't fully returned to this part of the city, making it the perfect place for someone like Seraphine to regroup. Sayara knelt behind a rusted-out transport vehicle, scanning the facility. Guard patrols moved in rigid patterns, disciplined and methodical. These weren't street thugs or remnants of the Syndicate's brute force. These were trained soldiers. Mercenaries. "She's already building her army," Val whispered. Sayara's grip tightened around her weapon. "Then we make sure they have nothing to fight with." Daniel motioned toward a cluster of supply crates being unloaded near the entrance. "Explosives are our best bet. Take out the stockpile before it reaches her hands." Sayara nodded. "Val, you handle the security grid. Make sure no alarms go off until it's too late. Daniel and I will plant the charges." They moved like shadows, slipping past the perimeter undetected. Val disappeared into the darkness, her fingers working over a small control pad, tapping into the facility's systems. Zyara and Daniel crept along the edge of the cargo bay, avoiding the mercenaries' patrol routes. The crates were stacked in neat rows, their contents stamped with unmarked symbols. Zyara pried one open, revealing sleek high-grade weaponry, far beyond what the Syndicate had ever used. "These aren't just leftovers," Daniel murmured. "She's importing." Zyara set her jaw. If Seraphine had supply chains off-world, this was bigger than any of them had realized. She quickly set the charges, pressing them deep into the stacks of crates. The explosives were small but powerful, designed to ignite the stockpile in a controlled detonation. They didn't need to level the building. Just make sure nothing inside could be used against them. Val's voice crackled through their earpieces. "You're about to have company. A transport just arrived. And you're not going to like who's stepping out." Zyara exchanged a look with Daniel before edging toward the side of the cargo bay, peering out toward the landing platform. Seraphine stood at the base of a sleek black transport, flanked by two guards in armor unlike anything the Syndicate had ever fielded. It was refined, efficient, military-grade. She had made contact with someone bigger. Someone beyond this world. Zyara's stomach twisted. They had been prepared to stop a new warlord from rising in the Syndicate's wake. They hadn't expected to be standing at the edge of something much worse. Daniel whispered, "Tell me we're still blowing this place to hell." Zyara's fingers hovered over the detonator. Destroying this supply stockpile would hurt Seraphine, but not if she had already secured more resources elsewhere. If she was working with off-world suppliers, they were dealing with something far beyond their reach. Seraphine turned slightly, speaking into a calm device, her expression calm and unreadable. She was still 2 steps ahead. Zyara clenched her jaw. "We light it up. But we need more than this." Val's voice was tense over the comms. "Then I hope you have a plan because they're heading inside." Zyara pressed the detonator. The night erupted in fire. The explosion ripped through the facility, sending shockwaves across the industrial sector. Guards shouted, scrambling for cover as flames consumed the stockpile. Zyara and Daniel moved fast, using the chaos to slip away. Seraphine remained standing at the edge of the destruction, her gaze locked on the fire. Not panicked. Not furious. Just calculating. Zyara's stomach dropped. Seraphine had expected this. They had cut her off from one resource, but how many more did she have? Daniel exhaled sharply as they disappeared into the shadows. "This isn't over." Zyara didn't look back. "No. It's just beginning."